They called her just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer whispered in the break room at St. Michael's Hospital in Colorado Springs when Katie Morrison walked past with a stack of patient charts. Just a nurse. Community college. No connections. No family money. No MD hanging on a wall in a mahogany frame. Just a nurse who moved through the ICU like she'd held lives together before, which she had, though he had no idea where, and it made his skin crawl because trauma surgeons like Dr. Mercer didn't take orders from people without degrees from schools with names that meant something. He didn't know that in exactly 16 days, Katie would place a needle into a dying man's chest cavity with the kind of precision that only comes from doing it in sandstorms while bullets screamed overhead. He didn't know that 12 attending physicians would stand frozen while she moved. He didn't know that by the time the sun set on that morning, his entire career would be built on the wreckage of trying to diminish her. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. St. Michael's Hospital in Colorado Springs smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee, the kind that's been sitting in the break room pot since shift change at 6 in the morning. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead, a sound like insects trapped in plastic, casting everything in the color of old bone. The ICU occupies the entire north wing of the third floor, 12 beds arranged in a circle with central nursing station positioned like a command post, monitors displaying vital signs that never stop talking, never allow silence. Katie Morrison knows this geometry by heart. She arrives at 5:33 a.m., 15 minutes before official shift start, moving through the darkened corridor with the kind of quiet efficiency that draws no attention. Her badge swings at her hip, RN Catherine Morrison, community college certified, registered nurse, and beneath her scrubs, beneath the fabric, sits a small folded American flag tucked in the inside pocket of her jacket locker, burgundy and white, pressed against the faded photograph of Marcus beside it. Marcus who took the IED so she didn't have to. Marcus who'd been her partner in the surgical tent outside forward operating base Shank for 7 months before Fallujah. Marcus whose coffin came back draped in exactly this flag. She checks the census board first. Bed 3, Colonel James Briggs, 58, admitted yesterday after complications from a contaminated anti-malarial medication exposure, the reason she's here, though no one at St. Michael's knows that, and no one can know. Captain Catherine Morrison doesn't exist at this hospital. Only Katie Morrison the ICU nurse exists, and she moves with a kind of careful anonymity that takes training most people don't have. The colonel's chart shows stable vitals, post-operative dressing change required this morning, no unusual complications overnight. She exhales once, steady, and walks toward his room. The morning light hasn't started yet. Outside the windows, Colorado Springs is still dark, streetlights casting orange pools on empty parking lots. Inside the ICU, the only movement is the rise and fall of ventilators, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors maintaining their electronic conversation, the occasional soft footfall of night shift nurses beginning their handoff rounds. Katie stands at the colonel's bedside for a moment, not touching anything, just observing. His breathing is even. O2 sat 94%. Heart rate 68. Blood pressure 130/82. Everything by the book, everything normal, everything indicating that this man will survive the exposure that was supposed to kill him quietly, without investigation, without questions that might lead back to the people who'd sourced the contaminated batch. She makes a note on the chart. Temperature normal. No signs of infection. Dressing dry and intact. She doesn't speak. The colonel is sleeping. By 6:58 a.m., the morning rounds begin. Dr. Mercer arrives with his residents trailing behind like pilot fish following a shark, his designer watch catching the fluorescent light, a Rolex, brushed steel, the kind that costs more than most nurses make in a month. He's 43 years old, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of voice that makes younger doctors flinch when he questions their judgment. Chief of Trauma Surgery at St. Michael's for 7 years. Medical school at Johns Hopkins. Fellowship at Massachusetts General. Board certified in trauma, acute care surgery, and critical care medicine. His pedigree is impeccable. His family name appears in medical journals dating back 30 years. His father was a cardiac surgeon. His grandfather was a cardiac surgeon. His great-grandfather was a cardiac surgeon at a time when surgery meant blood and faith and no antibiotics. Dr. Mercer clawed his way to this position without those advantages, which made them even sharper in his grip. He'd earned every credential, every title, every moment of deference that came his way. Katie stands at the medication cart when he passes, and she straightens slightly, not from fear but from professionalism, from the kind of practice subordination that keeps work smooth and complications minimal. She doesn't meet his eyes. This is deliberate. This is technique. A captain in the army knows when to be visible and when to be invisible, when to speak and when to observe. "Morning, Dr. Mercer," she says, her voice low and even, the tone of someone who understands hierarchy and respects it. He doesn't respond, which is normal. She is not a resident. She is not a fellow. She is not someone whose opinion he has requested. They move together through the morning circuit. Bed 1 is an 81-year-old with septic shock from aspiration pneumonia. Bed 2 is a 42-year-old construction worker recovering from a motor vehicle accident with multiple fractures. Bed 3 is the colonel. When they reach the colonel's room, Katie hands Dr. Mercer the chart without being asked, having already prepared it with the most recent vitals and observations, the kind of anticipatory work that disappears if it's done correctly. "Colonel Briggs is stable," she says. "Vitals unchanged since 2300 hours. Dressing intact. No fever. No inflection. No embellishment. Just data. Just information." But then something happens that Dr. Mercer notices, though he doesn't understand what he's seeing. The colonel wakes. His eyes open, and for a moment he's confused, the kind of confusion that comes from anesthesia and pain medication and the disorientation of waking in a hospital bed instead of wherever his memory expects to be. But then he sees Katie standing at the foot of his bed, and something in his expression changes. It's subtle. His shoulders drop by maybe an inch. His breathing settles. His hand, which had been clenched around the bed rail, relaxes. And when he speaks, his voice is different, clearer, stronger, the voice of a man who suddenly knows exactly where he is and who's been looking after him. "Morning," he says. "How long was I out?" Katie walks forward and checks the foresight with her fingers, gentle but thorough, the kind of assessment that takes 3 seconds but communicates everything. 12 hours, she says. "You're doing well." The way she says it, the way the colonel receives it, there's something happening here that doesn't fit into the normal hierarchy of a hospital room. The colonel nods like he's been given an order he understands completely. He doesn't ask for Dr. Mercer. He doesn't question her assessment. He accepts her word the way soldiers accept word from someone who knows what they're talking about. Dr. Mercer watches this. He watches the way Katie's hands move when she changes the dressing, economical, precise, practiced with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from nursing school but from somewhere else, somewhere that required this exact precision under conditions that would make most people freeze. He watches the way her fingers know exactly how much tension to apply, how to move the gauze without disturbing the wound, how to secure the tape with a crease that's perfect every time. He watches the colonel's face as he watches her work, and he sees respect there. Not gratitude. Not the normal patient-to-caregiver dynamic. Respect. The kind of respect that's built from shared experience, from trust that's been earned in circumstances he cannot imagine. And he hates it. By the time rounds finish at 8:15 a.m., Dr. Mercer has learned several things he doesn't like. First, Katie Morrison moves with a physical confidence that doesn't match her job title or her credentials. She doesn't shuffle or fidget. She doesn't apologize for being in the way. She occupies space the way a person occupies space who's comfortable with their own competence. Second, every combat veteran on the ward, and there are 4 of them, all Green Berets or Rangers recovering from various injuries, all the kind of men who normally speak only when spoken to, greets her with a formality that borders on ceremony. "Morning, "Yes, "Thank you, Third, when she walks past a patient's monitor, she glances at it, registers the numbers, and her face doesn't change because she's already processed exactly what those numbers mean. She doesn't need to stop and study them. She just knows. This is what makes Dr. Mercer's skin crawl. This is what keeps him thinking about her as he sits in his office at 8:36 a.m., drinking terrible hospital coffee and staring at the organizational chart on his wall. Katie Morrison has a bachelor's degree from Colorado State University's Community College Affiliate program. Her nursing license is from 2015. There's no military background listed in her personnel file. There's no explanation for why she moves like someone who's spent time in places where movement has to be efficient because inefficiency gets you killed. There's no reason for why combat veterans defer to her like she outranks them. There's no justification for why she commands a kind of respect in the ICU that took him 15 years and a Johns Hopkins diploma to earn. And that, Dr. Mercer decides, cannot stand. Not here. Not in his hospital. Not while he's breathing. He picks up his phone at 9:02 a.m. and calls his contact at the hospital credentialing board. He smiles while he speaks. His voice is warm. Collegial. Just a fellow professional checking in on a staff member's background. Nothing adversarial. Nothing that could be mistaken for anything other than due diligence. By 9:15 a.m., he's made 3 other calls. By 10:56 a.m., he's positioned himself at the nurse's station where Katie will have to pass during her med rounds. By 10:48 a.m., he's already begun. The patient room smelled of antiseptic and fresh flowers. Briggs' daughter had brought carnations, the kind that wilted too fast but tried anyway. Katie was adjusting the 4-pump when Dr. Mercer arrived with his entourage of residents, his voice already pitched loud enough to carry down the hallway. Nurse Morrison, these vitals you recorded are completely inconsistent with the monitor readings. Did they not teach basic assessment at your, where did you train again? His tone made it a question and an indictment simultaneously. Katie's hand stilled on the pump. One measured breath. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical wheeze beneath every word. The vitals are correct, doctor. The colonel spiked a fever at 0400 hours. She kept her voice level, factual, the kind of neutral that required iron discipline to maintain. Mercer turned to Briggs' daughter, his expression a portrait of clinical concern. I apologize for the confusion. We're working on improving our training standards. The daughter's eyes flickered between them, uncertainty blooming like a stain across her face. Briggs himself lay silent, watching Katie with an expression she'd seen before, the look of a soldier recognizing another soldier, even when one of them was in scrubs. 2 days later, the break room became a study in orchestrated abandonment. Katie sat with her lunch tray, a salad that suddenly tasted like cardboard, and watched the transformation happen in real time. The 3 nurses she'd laughed with last week, shared stories about impossible shifts, complained about the coffee machine that never worked, suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere. Linda, the charge nurse who'd helped Katie through her first difficult week, wouldn't meet her eyes as she grabbed her cup and left mid-sip, the abandoned coffee still steaming on the table like an accusation. From the medication room, Katie heard Mercer's voice drifting through the open door, confidential and poisonous, the kind of tone that made residents lean in close. Some nurses develop inappropriate attachments to military patients. Groupies, essentially. It's a documented psychological phenomenon. The residents nodded seriously, the way medical students did when authority spoke. The words hung in the air like contamination. Katie sat alone, chewing mechanically, tasting nothing but the knowledge that her isolation was no accident, it was architecture. Mercer had drawn blueprints and her colleagues had followed them. The real breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Katie arrived for her shift and found the formal written warning posted on the unit board where everyone gathered before rounds. The paper was bright white, the font crisp and official, her name printed like an accusation, Nurse Morrison, formal citation, providing unauthorized medical advice to patients outside scope of practice. Immediate corrective action required. Signed, Dr. Marcus Mercer, Chief of Surgery. The words blurred and sharpened as Katie read them, her breathing the only sound she could hear. One measured breath. Then another. She felt the hot tear escape before she could stop it, a single drop that fell onto the paper, and she wiped it away with the side of her hand without breaking eye contact with Mercer, who was watching from the nurse's station 30 feet away, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd just closed a trap. Katie walked directly toward him. The hallway seemed to elongate, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, and her boots made no sound against the tile floor. Mercer's smile turned predatory as she approached, the kind of smile that believed it had already won. Katie stopped precisely 2 feet from him, her voice quiet and absolutely steady, each word a measured weight. "Colonel Briggs was my replacement in Baghdad, Dr. Mercer. He got hit doing the job I used to do. And I will not apologize for keeping him alive." The smile faltered. For exactly 2 seconds, confusion crossed his face, the expression of a man who'd suddenly realized the geometry of the room had changed and he was no longer standing where he thought he was. Then it returned, harder now, defensive. "Then perhaps you're in the wrong profession, Nurse Morrison." Katie turned and walked back to the unit without responding. What she didn't say, what no one could ever know, was that monitoring Briggs' exposure to that contaminated batch of antimalarial drugs currently being investigated by the Department of Defense was exactly why she'd been placed at St. Michael's Hospital under deep cover. Her captain's rank and force record were buried under layers of fabricated community college credentials that would collapse under the slightest examination. If Mercer pushed hard enough, if he made the right phone calls, if he contacted the credentialing company where her false records supposedly originated, she would disappear. Not just from this hospital. From everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The contamination investigation was ongoing, and Colonel Briggs, who'd been hit by an IED in Fallujah while wearing combat boots she used to share a FOB with, was the primary witness to the entire supply chain corruption. His blood work, his medical records, his testimony were classified and critical. If Katie lost her position, if she was removed from the hospital before the investigation concluded, Briggs would have no one inside the system watching his back. No one who understood what they were really looking for. No one who had the clearance to connect the dots between his symptoms and the batch numbers on those drug containers that were now in a secure DOD facility 3 states away. Day shift, 1,400 hours exactly. Katie was changing Colonel Briggs' chest dressing when something shifted, not in the room, not in the monitor, but in the way Briggs' chest moved. His breathing pattern accelerated, shallow and desperate, his ribs heaving like a man drowning in air. The left side of his chest wall lagged behind the right, a visual asymmetry that made every nerve in Katie's body go electric. His trachea was deviating, a visible shift toward the right that she could see even without touching him. The monitor showed what she already knew, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone through water. 94, 91. 88, tension pneumothorax. Trapped air in the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, crushing the heart. She'd seen it a dozen times in field hospitals in Baghdad, in the dust and chaos of trauma bays where decisions were measured in seconds and hesitation meant a body bag. Katie hit the code button and called out calmly, her voice dropping into the register she'd trained herself to use in crisis: needle decompression kit, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now. The crash cart arrived within seconds, nurses converging like they'd been waiting for exactly this summons. But it was teaching rounds, the absolute worst possible timing. 12 attending physicians were in the hospital at that moment, consultants and seniors and junior faculty, and they flooded into Briggs' room like they'd been called to witness something rare and important. The space became crowded, hot, full of the smell of coffee and aftershave and the particular tension that comes when too many doctors occupy the same 4 walls. Dr. Mercer pushed through them, his face already hardening as he saw Katie reaching for the 14-gauge catheter needle, the silver tip catching the light. "Step back, Nurse Morrison. We'll wait for the surgical team." His voice carried the certainty of absolute authority, the kind that expected obedience without explanation. Katie didn't move. Her hands stayed exactly where they were. "Doctor, he has a tension pneumothorax. The surgical team is 15 minutes out. He'll be dead in 3. Briggs' lips were turning blue now, his saturation at 82 and falling like a weight through dark water, the monitor alarm screaming its electronic panic into the crowded room. Mercer stepped physically between Katie and the patient, his shoulder blocking her line to Briggs' chest, his voice dropping to ice. "I said step back. That's a physician-level procedure." Behind him, 12 doctors stood frozen in a tableau of abandonment. Some were bound by protocol, certain procedures belonged to certain credentials, hierarchy was law. Some were paralyzed by fear of Mercer's retaliation, the understanding that opposing the chief of surgery had consequences that echoed through careers. All of them watched the monitor alarm scream while doing absolutely nothing, a chorus of silence that weighed more than any accusation. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped its countdown. Briggs' eyes rolled back. Katie looked at the man whose replacement she'd once been in a city that still burned in her nightmares. She made her choice. Colonel Briggs' breathing pattern shifted mid-dressing change. Shallow. Rapid. His chest wall moving wrong, asymmetrical, one side collapsing inward while the other pushed out. Tracheal deviation. Katie's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. She'd seen this before. Fallujah, 2009. A blast casualty gasping in a combat support hospital tent while rounds thumped the perimeter walls. Tension pneumothorax. The monitor alarm screamed first. Oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 94, 89. 82, her eyes tracked the numbers climbing downward while her voice stayed level, controlled, ice-cold in its precision. "I need the needle decompression kit. Now." She was already moving toward the crash cart, her muscle memory recognizing the geography of emergency equipment the way old soldiers recognize the shape of their weapons in the dark. The kit was 3 feet away. Everything she needed was there: 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol swabs, tape, gauze. Her hands knew the procedure the way breath knows the lungs. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. One motion. That was the job. Dr. Mercer stepped directly in front of her. He wasn't tall, but he was blocking the cart with the full width of his shoulders, his face flushed the color of raw meat, his voice pitched low enough that only Katie could hear it clearly, though the 12 attending physicians scattered around the room certainly caught the implication. "We'll wait for the surgical team. Nobody touches this patient without my authorization." The monitor continued its desperate beeping. 78 now. Falling. Colonel Briggs was drowning in his own chest cavity, pressure building around his lungs, and Dr. Mercer had placed himself between the patient and the only nurse in the room with hands steady enough to keep him alive. Katie didn't ask again. She didn't apologize. She didn't hesitate. She shoved past Mercer hard enough to make him stumble backward 2 steps, his hip connecting with the metal rail of an empty gurney with a sound like a bell tolling. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just the shock of being physically moved by someone he'd been systematically destroying for 8 months. 12 attending physicians stood frozen around the room. 12 doctors with MD credentials and years of training, and not one of them moved. Not one of them stepped forward. The fear was a physical thing in the air, thicker than the antiseptic smell of the ICU, heavier than the weight of their stethoscopes. Cross Mercer and your career stalled. Question him and your next performance review became weaponized. Stay silent and pretend the protocol mattered more than the patient's oxygen saturation. Katie was already at Briggs' side, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a soldier who'd practiced this procedure in sandstorms, under mortar fire, with a patient bleeding out and the clock screaming. She didn't think about Mercer. Didn't register the purple spreading up his neck like a bruise. Didn't hear him opening his mouth to speak. She found the anatomical landmarks by touch, the second rib, the space below it, the exact coordinates her hands had memorized in a trauma tent 12 years ago. One efficient swab with betadine. The smell of iodine sharp and immediate. Then the needle, 14 gauge, pushed through the chest wall with the certainty of someone whose life had once depended on getting this right the first time. The hiss of air escaping was immediate. Instantaneous. Like opening a pressurized vessel. Like pulling the pin on something that had been ready to explode. Colonel Briggs gasped, a drowning man breaking the surface after his lungs had stopped believing in oxygen. His body went rigid for 1 second, then the muscles released, and he was breathing, actually breathing, his chest wall moving symmetrically again. The monitor began its climb, 85. 88, 92. 95, climbing toward normal like a man clawing his way out of darkness. Katie stabilized the catheter with tape and gauze, her hands perfectly steady. Not trembling. Not shaking. Not showing a single visible sign of what had just happened. She stepped back from the bed and turned to face Dr. Mercer, whose face had gone from white to purple in the span of 30 seconds, whose hands were clenching and unclenching at his sides like he wanted to hit something but didn't quite have permission to. "You just assaulted a physician," he said, his voice trembling with a rage so pure it seemed to radiate outward, making the air around him shimmer like heat off asphalt. "You performed a procedure completely outside your scope of practice. You're done." He pulled out his phone. Katie watched him dial. Watched the phone connect. Watched him activate the network he'd spent 15 years building, the kind of network that only existed because he'd clawed his way to chief of surgery through sheer competence and ruthless elimination of anyone in his way. First call, his former roommate on the hospital board. Voice urgent, almost intimate. "We have a serious problem. A civilian nurse just performed invasive emergency medicine without authorization. Touched me physically when I tried to stop her. This is a liability issue, potentially criminal. I need to discuss containment before this becomes a lawsuit." The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Mercer's jaw set tighter with each response. Second call, the State Nursing Licensing Bureau. This one took longer. Mercer pacing now, his voice shifting into a different register, official, concerned, the worried superior reporting a dangerous situation to the authorities. "I'm calling to request an emergency investigation into one of our nursing staff. Catherine Morrison. No, I don't have her social security number in front of me, but I can get it. The credentials she provided show community college training, but she's performing procedures that suggest formal surgical training she never disclosed. I'm concerned she's misrepresented her qualifications. Yes, I understand this is serious. That's exactly why I'm calling." Third call, the credentialing company listed on Katie's nursing application. The one that existed only on paper, the one that had verified credentials that were as real as the persona that wore them. This call was shorter. More pointed. Questions about specific training programs, dates of completion, certifications that would never be found because they were classified, sealed behind Pentagon firewalls and need-to-know restrictions. Mercer wasn't shouting. That was the thing that made it worse. He was being efficient. Professional. Methodical. He was pulling on threads that, if unraveled completely, would expose Katie's entire cover, and he was doing it with the precision of a man who'd spent his entire career understanding exactly which systems to manipulate to destroy people who threatened him. Katie stood at Briggs' bedside, her face expressionless except for the slight tension in her jaw. She watched Mercer make the calls. Watched 12 attending physicians pretend they weren't watching. Watched Colonel Briggs breathe, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 96 now, his pupils reactive, his heart rate normalized to a rhythm that meant he was going to live because one person in the room had refused to accept the alternative. By 1600, the overhead intercom paged Katie Morrison to Human Resources. By 1630, she was sitting across from a woman named Patricia who kept saying the word liability in different combinations, who kept looking at a folder with Katie's name on it, who kept sliding papers across the desk for Katie to initial, papers that formalized her termination for practicing medicine without a license, effective immediately. Her security badge was deactivated at 1647. The magnetic swipe sounded like a cell door closing. Katie walked out of St. Michael's Hospital carrying a cardboard box containing a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a half-dead succulent with soil spilling from the bottom, and a photograph of Marcus, her partner, KIA in Fallujah, 2011, tucked beside a small folded American flag that had draped his coffin. The flag was the only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to carry into her cover. The only thing that was actually hers. The rain in Colorado Springs fell like judgment. Within 40 minutes of stepping back from Colonel Briggs' bedside, his oxygen saturation now stable at 94%, his trachea back where it belonged, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of the living, Dr. Mercer made 3 phone calls from his private office with the door locked and the blinds drawn. The first call went to his former roommate at Johns Hopkins, a man who now sat on St. Michael's Hospital board and owed Mercer a favor from a fellowship recommendation made 15 years prior. "We have a credentialing problem," Mercer said, his voice steady and reasonable, the voice of a chief of surgery with legitimate concerns. "An ICU nurse who's been practicing outside her scope. I need this documented and escalated before she hurts someone. Her name is Katie Morrison. Community college credentials, but something doesn't add up. I'd appreciate your discretion on this." The second call went to the Colorado State Board of Nursing at their emergency line. Mercer identified himself by his full title and his medical license number, a gesture that loaded his words with institutional weight. "I'm reporting a potential fraud case," he said. "A nurse on my unit has misrepresented her credentials. She performed an emergency medical procedure today that exceeded her licensing scope, needle decompression without physician authorization. I have 12 attending physicians who witnessed the violation and are prepared to file formal statements." He waited while the intake officer confirmed the case number, then added quietly, "I'm concerned about patient safety. I believe there may be false credentials in her file." The third call was the one that would unravel her. He reached the director of the credentialing company that had processed Katie's employment paperwork 8 months earlier, a contractor called Meridian Health Solutions that handled civilian nursing applications for hospitals across the Rocky Mountain region. "I need to verify the authenticity of credentials for one of our staff," Mercer said, his tone conspiratorial now, the voice of one professional protecting another. "Katie Morrison. She has a community college RN license, but she's been performing advanced procedures. I'm wondering if you've ever run across any irregularities in her file. The way she moves, the way combat veterans respond to her, it's not normal. I suspect she might be military or claiming military experience. Can you pull her background?" He didn't have to ask them to investigate. He just had to ask the right question. By 6 o'clock that evening, the hospital's administrative office had received a formal complaint from the State Board of Nursing requesting an emergency investigation into potential licensure fraud. By 6:15, the credentialing company had flagged Katie's file as containing discrepancies that require immediate clarification. By 6:30, the hospital's chief compliance officer, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd never met Katie and had no investment in the outcome, received 3 separate documents and made a decision that took exactly 12 minutes. Katie was called to the HR office at 6:42 p.m. She knew what was coming the moment she saw Chen's face across the desk, not angry, but careful, the expression of someone following a protocol she didn't want to follow. A termination letter sat in front of her, already signed. "We've received notification from the State Board of Nursing and our credentialing contractor regarding potential falsification of your nursing license," Chen said, reading from a template. "You performed a medical procedure today, needle decompression, that exceeds the scope of practice for a registered nurse. Combined with questions about the authenticity of your credentials, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately for practicing medicine without a license." Katie sat motionless in the plastic chair, her wet scrubs clinging to her skin like a second failure. She didn't ask about the investigation. She didn't defend herself. She didn't mention that the needle decompression was an emergency intervention that any reasonably trained nurse could defend, that there were standing protocols, that a patient would have died otherwise. Instead she said, "I'll need my personal items from my locker." Chen nodded, relieved at the compliance. "Security will accompany you." The security guard was a kid named Marcus, coincidence that would have been funny under different circumstances, who looked genuinely uncomfortable as he followed her to the break room where her locker sat in a row of identical metal boxes. Katie turned the combination lock and gathered what was hers, a spare pair of socks, a protein bar she'd forgotten about, a water bottle with a marine sticker she should have thrown away months ago, and the cardboard box she'd prepared for exactly this contingency. The box contained the 3 things she'd allowed herself to carry into this cover. The cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in Comic Sans, a gift from her team at Forward Surgical Team Alpha in Baghdad, hand-decorated with their unit patch in permanent marker. It had survived 3 moves and a combat deployment and 8 months of pretending to be someone without history. A half-dead succulent in a terracotta pot that she'd been meaning to water for weeks. It was nearly brown now, the fleshy leaves desiccated. She'd kept it anyway because it was something to tend, something that required her attention even when she was pretending to be ordinary. Now it was just one more failure she was carrying out. And the photograph, the one she kept wrapped in tissue paper at the very bottom, beneath everything else. Marcus in his dress blues, the one taken 3 days before his first deployment. His arm around her waist, both of them grinning at the camera with the invulnerability of people who couldn't imagine loss. And tucked beside it, the small folded American flag that had draped his coffin, pressed into a neat triangle with perfect hospital corners by hands that knew how to fold with precision. 13 folds. 13 creases marking the death of a Marine Corps communications specialist who'd been her partner, her anchor, the reason she'd spent the last 3 months pregnant with their son before Daniel was born into a world that would only know his father through photographs. Security walked her to the employee exit at the east side of the hospital, not the main entrance where visitors came and went, but the workers' door where staff clocked out invisible to the public. Katie stepped into the Colorado Springs evening and found the sky had turned slate gray in the hour since she'd walked in for her shift. Rain started within seconds. Not the polite rain of afternoon showers, but the kind that meant business, that hammered the asphalt with the intensity of someone's anger made manifest. Katie stood on the sidewalk outside St. Michael's Hospital, water streaming down her face and neck, soaking through the scrub she'd changed into 9 hours earlier when she still had a job, when she still had a cover, when a colonel with a tension pneumothorax was just another patient and not the ticking clock that had ended everything. She walked 3 blocks to the bus stop at Academy and Nevada, the cardboard box growing heavier with every step. Rain was getting inside, the cardboard softening at the edges, the mug and the succulent and the flag and the photograph all slowly absorbing water like they were dissolving back into the world they'd been hidden from. The bus stop bench was soaked. Katie stood beside it, water pooling at her feet, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of 8 months collapsing. 8 months of moving like an orderly, speaking in deference, accepting insults with downcast eyes, keeping her hand steady while her cover eroded one humiliation at a time. The contaminated drug investigation was blown now, the whole reason she'd been placed at St. Michael's under fabricated nursing credentials, documenting the antimalarial medications being tested on military personnel without informed consent, the batch that had sickeningly high reports of neurological damage. A court case that was supposed to take down a pharmaceutical company and the military contracts that let them hide it. All of it compromised because a surgeon couldn't tolerate competence without credentials. Katie thought about calling her handler at DOD, the Pentagon number she'd memorized and never written down. She thought about explaining how 8 months of work had evaporated in the 15 seconds it took her to shove past Mercer and place a needle in an intercostal space. She thought about Marcus, who died because a different doctor in a different trauma bay had hesitated during a different crisis. She thought about doing this job for 15 years, Special Operations Surgical Team Leader, Forward Surgical Team Alpha, 3 tours in Baghdad, 2 more in Kandahar, and still being invisible. Still being questioned. Still having to prove that hands that had held lives together, hands scarred by shrapnel and training and choices made at 3 in the morning, still knew how to move. The rain tasted like failure. A cardboard box gets heavier every second you hold it. Katie was considering which bus route got her home to the apartment she'd rented in someone else's name, back to the cover identity she'd be peeling off like a uniform, when she heard footsteps sprinting up the hospital steps behind her. Young footsteps. Urgent. Familiar in a way that made her entire nervous system go still. No. Not here. Not now. But the footsteps didn't slow. They got louder, closer, and her voice cracked with adolescent fury and desperate love. Mom. Mom, they need to see these, you can't let them do this. Daniel. Her 15-year-old son, who had her dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, carrying something rectangular wrapped in her winter jacket. He was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, and he was shouting loud enough to turn heads all up and down Nevada Avenue. He was carrying her shadow box. The one she kept in the back of her closet. The one she'd never displayed, never mentioned the physical proof of every kill, every life saved, every moment she'd chosen duty over living. The Navy Cross. The Silver Stars. The Bronze Star with Velar device. The purple hearts that marked where the world had tried to take pieces of her and failed. He burst into the hospital lobby dripping rain and righteous anger, and Dr. Mercer was standing by the information desk reviewing paperwork, probably already composing his email to the board, already planning his narrative victory, when Daniel thrust the shadow box directly into his hands. Mercer's face went blank. Rain hammered the hospital lobby like applause, or like gunfire. Katie had heard enough of both to know the difference. She stood at the bus stop 3 blocks away, cardboard box pressed against her chest, when Daniel appeared. 15 years old and moving like he'd learned urgency from watching his mother. He sprinted up the hospital steps carrying a shadow box, the kind used for medals, the kind that holds a lifetime of decisions compressed into glass and mahogany. Water streamed off his dark hair, her eyes, and he was shouting before he even reached the revolving doors. "Mom, they need to see these. You can't let them do this." The lobby doors slid open. Daniel walked through them like he owned the place, shadow box held level, deliberate, the way someone carries something that matters more than oxygen. His voice carried that same precision, that same refusal to break. The evening staff turned. Security paused. The information desk clerk looked up from paperwork. And in the center of that attention, Dr. Mercer was standing by the desk reviewing something, probably composing his narrative victory, probably already planning the board email, when Daniel thrust the shadow box directly into his hands. Mercer's face went blank. The shadow box was mahogany with a glass front. Behind the glass, arranged in perfect military formation, were 4 items. The Navy Cross came first, its ribbon bright as fresh blood against the dark velvet. Then the Silver Star. The Bronze Star with Velar device sitting like punctuation. And pinned beside them, a citation card in Katie's own handwriting, Captain Catherine Morrison, Force Recon, Special Operations Surgical Team Leader, Baghdad, 2009. Daniel stepped back. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The lobby filled with people the way water fills a vacuum, not slowly but all at once. A Marine in dress blues who'd been visiting the VA wing. 2 Army medical officers waiting for the elevator. A Navy corpsman coming off shift. They moved toward the shadow box like gravity had changed direction. Colonel Briggs appeared in the doorway of the ICU, orderly pushing his wheelchair, and when he saw the medals his entire body went still. He looked at Katie. 2 beats. 3. And then he whispered something that froze every service member in earshot. Reaper 6. The call sign hung in the air like a detonation that hadn't finished echoing. Reaper 6 was a legend. Reaper 6 was a name that moved through special operations channels with the same reverence people usually reserved for the dead. Reaper 6 had stayed in a burning building in Baghdad while 12 other medics evacuated. Reaper 6 had kept a Delta operator breathing through wounds that should have killed him instantly. Reaper 6 had walked through fire so many times that people stopped believing she was human. Reaper 6 was Katie Morrison, and she was standing in front of them in scrubs with a cardboard box. A Marine Corps liaison officer, Captain Michael Halloway, his name tag read, stepped forward. He took the shadow box from Mercer's trembling hands with the kind of gentleness people use for coffins. He opened his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of official record, the kind of voice that transforms private struggle into historical fact. The Navy Cross, awarded to Captain Catherine Morrison for extraordinary heroism while serving as Special Operations Surgical Team Leader in Baghdad, for remaining in an exposed position during a 12-hour firefight to provide emergency surgical intervention under direct fire to personnel who would have died otherwise. He paused. The hospital sounds, the ventilators, the monitors, the ambient hum of fluorescent lights, all seemed to thin out, as if the building itself was listening. For actions that directly resulted in the survival of 7 military personnel and 1 civilian contractor who were classified as expectant casualties at time of initial assessment. Another pause. Mercer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The Silver Star, awarded for exceptional valor. The Bronze Star with Valor device, also for exceptional valor under fire. Holloway turned the shadow box so everyone could see the medals clearly. This is what Captain Morrison has been doing at St. Michael's, Dr. Mercer. This is who you blocked from saving Colonel Briggs. The lobby had gone so quiet you could hear the rain outside, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat. Then a voice cut through, sharp, authoritative, belonging to someone accustomed to being obeyed. A two-star general, visiting from the VA wing for an administrative review, stood in a uniform so decorated it caught the overhead lights like a mirror. He was looking at Katie's medals. Then he was looking at Katie. And then he rendered a full military salute, the kind that takes 2 seconds and means everything, the kind that transforms the space between two people into something sacred. Katie returned it with parade ground precision. Her back straightened. Her hand moved from the cardboard box to her forehead in a salute that had muscle memory deeper than bone. For just a moment, the nurse disappeared. The woman who remained was someone who'd made decisions under fire, who'd held people together when everything was coming apart, who'd carried secrets that cost more than most people could measure. Mercer's face had gone from blank to purple. He opened his mouth. The general looked at him and said, simply, "You should leave." The hospital CEO appeared, materializing the way administrators do when disaster becomes public record. He was stammering apologies, looking at Katie with the particular horror of someone who'd just realized he'd been complicit in something irreversible. He was reaching toward her with both hands when a courier in a dark suit entered through the emergency doors, rain-soaked and moving with federal purpose. The courier carried a folder stamped classified on multiple sides. She handed it to the CEO and said, "Pentagon verification of Captain Morrison's active duty status on DOD investigative assignment." The CEO's hands fell to his sides. What happened next didn't require anyone to explain. A visitor had been filming, phone out, recording the moment Mercer blocked the crash cart, the moment Katie shoved past him, the moment his face contorted when someone whispered that she'd saved Briggs' life, that she'd done something impossible. That video was uploaded within 4 minutes. It had 10,000 views by evening. 100,000 by midnight. By the next morning, it was on the news. The anchor described it as a chief surgeon prioritizing ego over patient safety and a decorated combat veteran confronting workplace abuse in real time. The hashtag trended for 72 hours. But the real damage came from somewhere else entirely. Dr. Richard Castellano, Mercer's medical school mentor, the man who'd written his residency recommendations and opened doors that Mercer's background alone could never have accessed, was eating dinner with his grandson when the kid showed him the video. Castellano was a retired army surgeon with 2 tours in Vietnam, with hands that had performed emergency medicine in jungle field hospitals, with scars and clarity that comes from having already survived the worst. He watched his protégé physically block Captain Morrison from performing a procedure that Castellano himself had taught to special operations medics, watched Mercer's face contort with rage when her service was revealed. At 0800 the next morning, the hospital board received Dr. Castellano's statement. It was formal. It was devastating. It ended with the line, "I will withdraw my association with any institution that employs him." The board review took 6 hours. The decision was unanimous. Dr. Mercer was terminated for interference with patient care, workplace harassment, and abuse of authority. His medical license entered a review process that would conclude with suspension. His institutional network, the people he'd called to destroy Katie, distanced themselves immediately, recognizing the toxic weight of association. For weeks later, Dr. Mercer was driving a medical supply van through rural Colorado, delivering boxes of gauze and specimen containers to clinics that couldn't afford dedicated staff. His hand shook on the steering wheel when he saw Katie's name in a news article about DOD reforms, listed as a consultant. He saw her photograph, formal in dress uniform, captain's bars visible, that composed face that had never broken even when he was destroying her. He understood, finally, that he'd never actually seen her at all. 6 months after the lobby confrontation, Katie Morrison sat in an official consultant's office at St. Michael's Hospital, her investigation complete. The contaminated batch of antimalarial drugs, the real reason she'd been embedded in the ICU, had been traced to a supplier with links to 3 separate military contracts. 12 officers faced court-martial. 17 patients received treatment for the toxicity that would have been missed without her surveillance. Colonel Briggs was one of them. He would recover fully. The cardboard box was gone, donated to a hospital charity. But the folded flag sat on her desk, the one that had draped Marcus's coffin in Fallujah, the one piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to carry through 8 months of invisibility. Beside it sat a new photograph, Daniel pinning captain's bars to her dress uniform at a ceremony where the hospital CEO had presented a formal apology and Colonel Briggs, fully recovered, had given a speech about the medics who save lives in shadows. The world's okayest nurse mug sat beside the flag. It was cracked down the side, glued back together, but Katie kept it anyway. On her last day as an embedded operative, she visited Colonel Briggs in his discharge room. He was leaving, finally whole, moving back to his family in North Carolina where they were waiting with patients and flags of their own. "You saved my life twice," he said. "Once in Baghdad. Once here." Katie adjusted his discharge paperwork and thought about the 12 doctors who had stood frozen while monitors screamed, about the choice between mission safety and human life, about Marcus and the flag, about the cost of doing the right thing when everyone's watching and when no one is. She thought about Mercer delivering supplies in a van, a small man made smaller by his own choices. She thought about 8 months of invisibility, of being underestimated, of the power that lives in being someone no one bothers to see. True heroism, Katie said quietly, is what you do when the world stops watching. She pinned her captain's bars to her uniform collar, visible now, and walked out of St. Michael's Hospital into Colorado sunshine with nothing left to hide. Did you know there are legends walking among us right now, people with medals and scars and stories they'll never tell unless you ask? They're in hospitals, in classrooms, in cubicles, and fire stations. They're invisible until the moment they're not. If you know someone like that, say thank you. Tell them their name. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about the ones who've seen the worst and still choose to give the most. Comment below, who's the hidden hero in your life? Someone who showed you that true character isn't about credentials, it's about choices.